On a freezing February night in 1959, 9 hikers vanished in the remote Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. When rescuers finally located their camp, what they uncovered sparked one of the most chilling mysteries of the 20th century: a tent slashed open from the inside, belongings left untouched, and bodies scattered across the snow, some half-dressed, others bearing injuries so severe they defied explanation. For decades, theories swirled, from secret military experiments to UFO encounters. But now, AI has offered chilling new insights into the Dyatlov Pass incident, and the truth may be far worse than anyone imagined. The story begins in January 1959, when 10 students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on a trek designed to earn them the highest certification in Soviet mountaineering. To qualify for this Category 3 achievement, they had to ski more than 300 kilometers through harsh winter terrain. The leader, Igor Dyatlov, a disciplined 23-year-old engineering student, was admired for his meticulous planning and calm authority. Alongside him were 9 others: Zina Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Krivonischenko, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Yuri Yudin. They were young, intelligent, and seasoned adventurers, between 20 and 38 years old, with years of experience braving the Russian wilderness. Friends and family later recalled how they thrived in the cold, often treating brutal weather not as a burden, but as part of the challenge. Their destination was Mount Otorten, a peak whose name in the local Mansi language ominously means "don't go there." To the group, that warning was more folklore than prophecy. This was the Soviet era of strength and endurance, when triumph over nature was celebrated as both personal victory and national pride. On January 25th, they boarded a northbound train, filling their journey with songs, journal entries, and jokes that still survive in recovered diaries, haunting snapshots of normal days before disaster. By January 27th, they reached the last settlement of Vizhai, resupplied, and prepared for the uninhabited wilderness ahead. It was here that fate intervened. Yuri Yudin, plagued by sciatica and knee pain, turned back, unknowingly saving his life while condemning his 9 friends to their fate. The remaining hikers pressed onward, facing bitter winds and plunging temperatures, yet still describing cheerful meals, friendly debates, and laughter in their journals. On January 31st, they cached extra supplies in a river valley before climbing toward a mountain pass that would later bear Dyatlov's name. The next day, February 1st, would prove decisive. Veering off course in worsening weather, they found themselves exposed on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, translated as Mountain of the Dead. Rather than retreating to the forest, Dyatlov chose to pitch their tent on the barren slope itself, cutting into the snow for stability. To experienced mountaineers, it was a rational choice, conserving time and energy. That night, the group ate their final hot meal, wrote lighthearted notes, and took photographs of each other bundled against the storm. Then, in the early hours, something happened, something so sudden and terrifying that it forced all 9 to rip through their tent and flee into the howling night without boots, coats, or vital gear. The truth of what occurred on that mountainside would remain hidden for weeks until rescuers stumbled upon the grim scene. At first, no one worried when the hikers missed their February 12th check-in. Delays were common. But as the days dragged on, families grew anxious, and soon their desperate pleas forced the authorities to act. The Ural Polytechnical Institute soon organized a search party, first made up of fellow students and teachers, and when days passed with no results, soldiers, helicopters, and even local Mansi hunters familiar with the unforgiving landscape were called in. On February 26th, rescuers stumbled upon something strange high on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. At first glance, the half-buried tent looked ordinary, tilted under snowdrifts, but when they dug it out, they saw the canvas had not collapsed naturally. It had been slashed open from the inside. Snow filled the gaping rips, covering neatly arranged blankets, boots, and clothing, as though the hikers had fled in a sudden panic. To seasoned rescuers, it was baffling. Why would 9 experienced mountaineers, in sub-zero temperatures, cut their way out of a tent instead of using the entrance? And why abandon coats, felt boots, and food supplies that were right there within reach? Footprints led away from the tent, at least 8 or 9 distinct tracks, but these were not the prints of prepared mountaineers. They showed bare feet, socks, and even a single shoe, the trail winding downhill toward a forest before vanishing into snowdrifts. At the forest's edge, beneath a cedar tree, the first 2 bodies were found, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko, both dressed only in underwear, their hands raw and bloody from clawing at bark in desperation. Nearby, the charred remains of a small fire marked a futile attempt at survival. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered. Igor Dyatlov, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, spaced as though they had collapsed while trying to crawl back uphill. Dyatlov lay face-up clutching branches, Zina farther along with clenched fists, and Slobodin with a fractured skull, likely from repeated falls before succumbing to the cold. 5 hikers were accounted for, but 4 remained missing. Weeks later, in early May, thawing snow revealed their bodies in a ravine deeper in the forest, sheltered in a shallow den cut into the hillside. These last 4, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, told an even more disturbing story. They were dressed more warmly, some wearing clothing stripped from their fallen comrades, yet their injuries defied explanation. Thibault-Brignol's skull was fractured, Zolotaryov's chest crushed with force likened to a car crash, Dubinina's ribs broken, and, most disturbingly, her tongue and parts of her face missing. Kolevatov showed fewer wounds, but stood no chance of survival in the extreme cold. Stranger still, the injuries caused catastrophic internal trauma without external bruising or cuts, leaving doctors unable to explain how such damage occurred. Adding to the mystery, traces of radiation were found on some clothing, though later reports suggested it might have come from materials the hikers handled in their studies or workplaces. By spring, all 9 bodies had been recovered, but the questions had only multiplied. Why had trained mountaineers abandoned shelter without boots or coats? Why had some frozen while others suffered violent internal trauma? And what accounted for the missing tongue and eyes? The Soviet public was shaken, but in May 1959, officials quietly closed the case with a vague explanation. The hikers had died from a compelling natural force. Files were sealed, restricted from public view, and whispers of a government cover-up began to spread. Instead of bringing clarity, the official investigation only deepened the intrigue, leaving one haunting question: what anomaly had investigators truly found? To grieving families and curious outsiders, the details of the Dyatlov Pass discovery looked far more sinister than the official reports admitted. Several bodies bore burns on their hands and legs, as if they had come into contact with fire, though only a small campfire was found nearby. Others displayed odd skin discoloration, a deep orange-brown tan that relatives insisted they had never seen in life. Most unsettling of all, traces of radioactive isotopes were detected on the clothing of 2 victims. How could radiation appear in the snowbound wilderness of the Urals? Investigators also recovered journals and cameras from the group. Their diaries were cheerful and mundane, filled with light-hearted jokes, plans for the route ahead, and even a playful note about building snowmen, an entry that later fueled wild Yeti theories. The photographs showed smiling faces despite worsening weather, but the final frames were far stranger. Blurry night shots of glowing orbs or streaks of light in the sky. Some have interpreted these as evidence of fireballs or secret weapons tests, while others dismiss them as overexposed shots in difficult conditions. The footprints around the campsite only deepened the mystery. They showed people walking calmly, not running, as if leaving under some compulsion rather than in panic. Many prints made in bare feet, socks, or a single shoe. Why would 9 seasoned mountaineers abandon their only shelter in sub-zero temperatures without boots, coats, or signs of chaos? Local Mansi hunters were interviewed, but they denied any involvement, insisting that while the mountains were dangerous, they were not haunted. Still, villagers reported seeing glowing orbs in the sky around the same time, fueling speculation about secret military tests. Families of the victims demanded answers about the burns, the missing eyes and tongue, the radiation, and the strange orange skin, but they were met only with silence or vague reassurances. By May 1959, the case was abruptly closed with a deliberately vague conclusion. The hikers had died due to an unknown compelling natural force. The phrase was ambiguous enough to avoid political fallout but clear enough to end the investigation. For families, it was no explanation at all. For the public, it was fuel for rumors. Why were the files classified? Why was radiation mentioned, but never explained? Why had 9 young people died in circumstances more like a horror story than a hiking tragedy? The official case had ended, but the mystery of Dyatlov Pass had only just begun. Almost immediately, rumors swirled that the hikers had witnessed something otherworldly, and over the decades, countless theories emerged to explain the anomaly. Some researchers argue that the hikers became unwitting casualties of Soviet military testing. The Ural Mountains, remote and sparsely populated, were often used for secret experiments, and one theory suggests the group stumbled into the path of parachute mines, explosives dropped from planes that detonate just above the ground. Such blasts can inflict massive internal injuries while leaving little visible damage, eerily matching the autopsies of hikers like Zolotaryov and Thibaut Brignol, whose ribs and skulls were crushed as if they had been in a car crash, yet whose skin showed almost no wounds. The burns found on Dubinina and Kolevatov could also have been caused by the heat of such a blast. Radiation deepened the mystery. Elevated levels were detected on some clothing, and later reports even described garments that glowed under ultraviolet light. Although 2 of the hikers had previously worked at nuclear facilities, suggesting possible contamination, conspiracy theorists dismissed this as too convenient. To them, it pointed toward a radiation-related weapons test, perhaps nuclear-powered, that the group had accidentally witnessed. Supporting this suspicion was the investigation itself. Files were sealed, witnesses silenced, and the official conclusion cited only an unknown compelling natural force, a phrase so vague it sounded like a cover-up. Some even speculated that the hikers were mistaken for spies or killed during military maneuvers, their deaths buried in Cold War secrecy. Yet not all explanations relied on conspiracies. Later researchers turned to the harsh environment of the Urals themselves. One idea focused on katabatic winds, sudden, violent downdrafts capable of flattening tents and suffocating explorers. If such a surge struck the Dyatlov camp, the hikers may have had only seconds to cut their way out of the tent and escape. Another theory centered on infrasound, low-frequency vibrations produced when wind passes over a mountain. Though inaudible, infrasound can induce nausea, dizziness, and overwhelming dread. A 2013 study suggested that waves generated by the dome-shaped peak of Kholat Syakhl might have caused panic, driving the group to flee barefoot and underdressed into the night. These meteorological explanations neatly account for the hikers' irrational behavior, but they struggle to explain the devastating injuries. Winds and sound waves alone do not shatter ribs or crack skulls. In the earliest stages of the investigation, suspicion briefly fell on the Mansi, the indigenous people who lived and hunted in the region. Some wondered whether the hikers had trespassed on sacred land, provoking violence. But this theory was dismissed almost as quickly as it arose. The Mansi had been among the first to join the search. No defensive wounds or weapon marks were found, and no evidence supported an attack. Animal predation was also considered, but ruled out. Wolves and bears roamed the Urals, yet no tracks were found near the campsite. The tent cuts came from inside, and the missing tongue and eyes of Dubinina, often sensationalized, were consistent with natural decomposition and scavenging by small animals after death. What made the Dyatlov Pass tragedy so haunting was not just the loss of 9 young lives, but the void of answers it left behind. Every strange detail, burns, radiation, missing body parts, crushed bones, glowing orbs in the sky, seemed to demand an explanation. And in the absence of certainty, theories multiplied. For decades, journalists, scientists, and amateur sleuths offered scenarios ranging from UFOs and secret weapons to avalanches and curses. None fully satisfied. Each left gaps that spawned the next. The mystery endured, suspended between folklore and cold case, until 2019, when the Russian government reopened the investigation. In 2020, officials announced their conclusion. The hikers had died as a result of a slab avalanche. At first, the explanation felt anticlimactic. After 60 years of speculation, an avalanche seemed too ordinary, too simple. But beneath that single word lay a complex and chilling reconstruction, one that finally tied together nearly all the physical evidence with the cold, indifferent power of nature. Unlike the roaring, cinematic avalanches of disaster films, a slab avalanche is silent and insidious. It occurs when a compact sheet of snow fractures and slides downslope as a single block, like glass shattering along an invisible fault line. Such slides can unleash crushing force on anyone in their path, yet leave little evidence behind. Dyatlov's group, camped on an exposed slope of Kolit-Syakhl, had unknowingly chosen the worst possible spot. To pitch their tent, they cut into the snowpack, destabilizing layers already weakened beneath the surface. Combined with additional snowfall and high winds, this created the conditions for disaster. Hours later, the snow slab broke loose. The force of the collapse explains the severe injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, but little external trauma, exactly what would occur if bodies were pressed against hard ground under immense snow pressure. Trapped in darkness under the weight of snow, the hikers cut their way out of the tent. With some already injured and their shelter destroyed, they had little choice but to flee downslope toward the treeline. Their footprints, calm and deliberate, show they were not running blindly, but trying to regroup. At the forest edge, they lit a small fire, stripped branches, and even climbed trees to gather wood. But temperatures plummeted to -30°C, and the poorly dressed Doroshenko and Krivonischenko were the first to die. Others tried to survive by taking clothes from the dead. 3, including Dyatlov, attempted to crawl back to the tent but froze before reaching it. The last 4 pressed deeper into a ravine, where another collapse buried them beneath meters of snow, crushing their bodies fatally. Modern snow modeling, even using simulation tools developed by Disney for the film Frozen, has since confirmed that such a delayed slab avalanche was not only possible but likely. It explains nearly every piece of evidence: the injuries, the cut tent, the lack of avalanche traces weeks later, even the radiation, linked to 2 hikers' past work with nuclear materials, and the glowing orbs caused by missile tests in the region. In the end, the Dyatlov mystery may not have been a tale of aliens, secret weapons, or curses, but of physics, weather, and human vulnerability in the face of nature's hidden dam.